It is the autumn of 1943, and somewhere in the grey industrial outskirts of Sutton Oakfield, a man in a white laboratory coat holds a small glass vial up to the light. The liquid inside is colourless, almost unremarkable, the kind of thing you might mistake for water or perhaps a cheap cologne. He notes something in a leather-bound ledger, sets the vial carefully back in its rack, and walks quietly to a telephone on the wall. Within the hour, a dispatch rider is on his way to London. Whatever is in that vial, it is clearly important enough to wake someone up. The substance has no dramatic name. Its official designation is buried in files that would remain classified for decades. Those who worked with it at the time knew it simply as the compound, or, occasionally, with a certain dry British wit that characterized much of the Special Operations Executive's internal culture, as the tailor's nightmare. The name, as it turns out, is rather apt. What the chemists at Sutton Oakfield had synthesized through a combination of deliberate experimentation and what at least one surviving account describes as a certain amount of fortunate accident was a substance capable of attacking the chemical bonds in wool-based textiles, not burning them, not dissolving them all at once in some dramatic fashion. Something subtler and considerably more sinister than that. The compound would penetrate fabric invisibly, lie dormant for days or even weeks, and then, upon contact with moisture, rain, morning dew, the condensation inside a greatcoat collar on a cold night, begin a slow but relentless degradation of the fibres. A uniform treated with the compound would appear entirely normal. It would pass inspection, it would be worn, and then it would fall apart. The German Wehrmacht issued its soldiers wool-blend uniforms. The Waffen-SS favored similar materials. In the occupied territories of Western Europe, in the forests of Yugoslavia, in the mountain passes of northern Italy, German soldiers depended on their uniforms for warmth, for camouflage, and in no small measure for the psychological armor that comes from wearing the uniform of a powerful institution. What the British had found was a way to attack not the soldier, not the supply line, but something stranger and more corrosive than either, the confidence that comes from being properly dressed. This is the story of that compound, the people who made it, and what actually happened when it was used. The problem that led to the development of what we might now call a textile degradation agent was not, at its root, a chemical problem at all. It was a logistical one, and it grew from the particular difficulties of supplying resistance movements operating deep inside occupied Europe. By 1941, the Special Operations Executive, the organization Winston Churchill famously directed to set Europe ablaze, had established networks of agents and resistance fighters across France, the Low Countries, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece. These networks required weapons, explosives, radio equipment, forged documents, and money. All of it had to be delivered by parachute drops, usually at night, into fields and forests chosen for their isolation. The weight limits on a Lysander aircraft or a converted Halifax bomber were not generous. Every kilogram dropped into a French meadow was a kilogram that could not be spent elsewhere. The question that occupied the planners at SOE's Baker Street headquarters was a persistent and frustrating one. How do you degrade an enemy's effectiveness without using explosives? Explosives were heavy, complicated to manufacture in clandestine conditions, and, critically, loud. They announced themselves, they triggered reprisals, they brought the Gestapo to the door. What was needed was a category of weapon that worked quietly, something that could be introduced into an environment and left to do its work over days or weeks, without a single gunshot or explosion to mark the moment of sabotage. The Germans had invested enormous resources in developing exactly this class of weapon themselves. Their use of chemical contamination against enemy food and water supplies, though often overstated in popular history, was a genuine area of wartime research. The British, characteristically, approached the same problem from a different direction. Rather than attacking people directly, they asked what else could be attacked. The answer, when it came, emerged partly from a civilian background that had nothing whatsoever to do with warfare. Several of the chemists recruited into SOE's technical branches had pre-war experience in the textile industry. Britain was, after all, still a major producer of wool and woolen cloth. The chemistry of how wool fibre behaved, how its proteins responded to heat, moisture, acid and alkali was well understood in Bradford and Halifax and the mills of the West Riding. What was less well understood, until someone in a laboratory began asking the right questions, was whether that chemical vulnerability could be weaponized. The answer was yes, but getting there required solving a problem that proved genuinely difficult. How do you create a compound that is stable enough to be handled, packaged, transported by parachute, and distributed by resistance fighters operating under the constant threat of search and capture, yet reactive enough to do its work reliably when finally applied? The team that solved this problem was based, for most of its relevant work, at a facility that does not appear on any wartime map under an honest name. Records that have since been partially declassified refer to it variously as Station 12 and as the Aston House facility in Hertfordshire, though the specific research program in question appears to have been conducted at a satellite location whose exact address remains, even now, something of a bureaucratic ambiguity. What we know is that by mid-1942, a group of chemists, drawn from the academic world, from ICY and from several smaller industrial laboratories, had identified the mechanism they were looking for. Wool fibre is composed primarily of keratin, a protein whose structure depends on sulfur-containing chemical bonds called disulfide bridges. These bridges give the fibre its strength, its elasticity, and its resistance to simple mechanical damage. Interrupt the disulfide bridges and the fibre loses integrity. The keratin chains separate. The cloth weakens. The challenge was finding a compound that would attack these bonds specifically, without being so reactive that it destroyed whatever container it was stored in, or announced its presence through color, odor, or any other detectable property. It also needed to be stable enough to survive a parachute drop, storage in a barn or a root cellar, and handling by people who were not chemists and who would be doing their work in darkness, often under considerable stress. The compound the team eventually developed was, in the language of the chemists who made it, a substituted thiol derivative, a molecule built around a sulfur-containing reactive group, modified to reduce its immediate volatility while preserving its long-term capacity to attack keratin bonds. In practical terms, what this meant was a liquid that smelled of almost nothing, that was stable at a room temperature for months, and that could be applied to cloth using nothing more complicated than a small brush or a soaked sponge. The crucial innovation, and this is the point that separates the British compound from earlier, cruder attempts to achieve something similar, was what the chemists called the delayed activation mechanism. In simple terms, the compound included a second chemical component that acted as a kind of protective envelope around the reactive part of the molecule. This envelope was stable in dry conditions but broke down on contact with water, which meant that a uniform treated with the compound would behave entirely normally in dry weather. Only when it got wet, in rain, in fog, wading across a river, would the reactive agent be released, and by then the soldier wearing it would have no idea what was happening to his clothes. The compound was manufactured in relatively small quantities, exact figures remain classified, and estimates among historians vary considerably. But what can be said is that production was measured in litres rather than tons. This was not a mass production operation. It was a specialist capability, something to be used with precision rather than saturated across a theatre of operations. Each consignment was packaged in small glass bottles, padded in sawdust, and incorporated into supply drops as a secondary payload alongside more conventional material. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Application required no technical knowledge. Resistance operatives were briefed that the liquid should be applied to fabric using any absorbent material, a cloth, a sponge, even a handful of moss in an emergency, with particular attention to high-wear areas, collar linings, cuffs, the inside of waistbands, the knees and elbows of uniform jackets. These were the places where friction and moisture combined most reliably. The compound needed only to be present in the fabric. Time and the weather would do the rest. In the field, the compound found its most documented use in occupied France and in Yugoslavia, where the partisan networks maintained by SOE had sufficient organization to receive supply drops, distribute material to specific operatives, and carry out targeted applications with some degree of control. In France, particularly in the region around Lyon in 1943 and 1944, there are accounts, fragmentary, often second-hand, sometimes recorded only in post-war debriefings, of German garrison troops complaining to their quartermasters about uniform deterioration at a rate that could not be explained by normal wear. Collar seams failing, sleeve linings separating, the coarse wool of greatcoats developing weak patches that tore without apparent cause. German supply records from several occupied French cities, partially recovered and analyzed in the decades after the war, show a notable spike in uniform replacement requests from certain garrison units during this period, though the records do not, of course, explain why. In Yugoslavia, the situation was somewhat different. The partisan forces operating under Tito's command were both better organized and more willing to undertake the kind of patient, methodical sabotage that the compound required. British liaison officers attached to Yugoslav partisan units reported in dispatches from late 1943 and early 1944 that the compound had been applied to uniforms being laundered at facilities used by German and Italian occupation forces, a delivery method that required extraordinary nerve from the operatives involved, but that produced, according to those same dispatches, results that were described as satisfying. The psychological dimension of these results deserves particular attention because it points to something that the original planners at Baker Street had understood intuitively. A soldier whose uniform is falling apart is not merely physically uncomfortable. He is also, in a very specific way, humiliated. The uniform is authority made visible. It is the institutional claim made flesh and fabric. When it disintegrates, something more than cloth is lost. The Germans were not, it should be said, ignorant of the concept of textile sabotage. Their own chemical warfare research establishment, the Heeresversuchsanstalt at Spandau, had conducted investigations into similar possibilities, and there is at least one documented instance of a German effort to develop a compound intended to degrade rubber-based materials, a capability that, if realized, would have had significant implications for Allied vehicle tires and gas mask components. What the Germans did not develop, as far as available records indicate, was anything directly equivalent to the British textile degradation agent. The closest analogue in their arsenal was a simpler contact acid approach, essentially a concentrated acidic solution that would damage wool fibres on contact. But this lacked the delayed activation mechanism that made the British compound genuinely effective in the field. A contact acid approach produces visible damage immediately, which means it is detected immediately. The whole point of the British innovation was that it was not detected until it was far too late for the information to be useful. The Americans, working through the Office of Strategic Services, were made aware of the British compound sometime in 1943. According to documents held at the National Archives in both London and Washington, the OSS expressed considerable interest but ultimately did not develop their own version during the war, partly because their supply operations prioritized heavier, more conventional sabotage material, and partly because the manufacturing process, while not technically complex, required a level of chemical expertise that the Americans found difficult to embed in their forward facilities at the time. The British compound remained, in both operational and historical terms, a distinctly British capability, which is to say, it was subtle, ingenious, slightly eccentric, and in practical terms rather harder to evaluate than a good explosive. Assessing the actual historical impact of the textile degradation compound is genuinely difficult, for reasons that go beyond the simple classification of wartime records. The nature of the weapon makes its effects inherently hard to attribute. A soldier who reports that his uniform is deteriorating does not conclude that someone has been sabotaging his laundry. He concludes that the supply system is failing, that quality control in German uniform manufacturing has declined, or that his personal servant has been washing his clothes incorrectly. The causal chain is deliberately broken at the point of application. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the compound contributed to what historians of the SOE period have come to call the infrastructure of demoralization, a constellation of small invisible attacks on the day-to-day functioning of the occupation apparatus, none of which was decisive in isolation, but which, accumulated across months and years, imposed a tax on German administrative and logistical capacity that is genuinely difficult to quantify, but almost certainly not zero. The compound's legacy in the history of chemical and materials warfare is somewhat ambiguous. It does not appear in most standard accounts of wartime chemical weapons, partly because it was never used against human physiology directly, and partly because the relevant files remained classified long enough that the early historiography of SOE simply did not have access to them. For those interested in examining the physical record, a small number of the original glass delivery bottles have survived and can be found in the collection of the Imperial War Museum, though they are not permanently on display. The chemist's ledger from Sutton Oakfield, or at least a ledger that corresponds to the period and location described in surviving dispatches, is held in the National Archives at Kew, catalogued under a reference that the archivist will provide upon direct inquiry. There is a warehouse somewhere in occupied Lyon. It is winter, 1944, and the hour is just past midnight. A woman moves quietly between rows of shelving, her torch shielded to a thin beam. She stops at a rack of Feldgrau greatcoats, neatly folded and waiting for distribution. She takes a small glass bottle from her coat pocket, removes the stopper, and soaks a square of cloth. She works quickly and without expression, moving from coat to coat, paying particular attention to the collars and the cuffs. She is done in 11 minutes. She restoppers the bottle, replaces it in her pocket, and leaves the same way she came in. She does not know the chemistry of what she has just done. She knows only that it works, and that this is enough. Somewhere between 100 and 300 greatcoats, the records are imprecise, are folded back onto their shelves. In 3 days, they will be distributed to garrison troops. Those troops will wear them through February and March, through the cold rains of the Rhone Valley, through river crossings and wet mornings on checkpoint duty. They will notice, gradually, that their coats are not holding together. They will apply for replacements through proper channels. The paperwork will take weeks. In the meantime, they will be cold. It is not a decisive blow. It will not shorten the war by a single day, not on its own. But it is real, and it is measurable, and it is the product of a particular kind of thinking. Patient, precise, and profoundly unglamorous, that characterized some of the best work done by the people of the Special Operations Executive in their particular corner of the Second World War. They did not set Europe ablaze, not always and not all of them. Sometimes they simply made it cold. The compound that made German uniforms dissolve in the rain was not a wonder weapon. It was something more interesting than that. It was proof that you could fight an empire with a glass bottle and 11 minutes in a warehouse if you understood what an empire actually depended on. It depended on cloth, and the British, as it turned out, understood cloth rather well.